All right, good afternoon. I'm going to actually be a little mobile, so I won't be stationary at this mic. How are you all doing? Good. All right, I'll take that. I usually like to try to take the temperature of the room, ask folks how they're doing, and sometimes, particularly when it's after lunch, and it's like, how y'all doing? And I'm like, we're going to get a do-over. We're going to act like we want to be together and spend some quality time, okay? So first, before I get into my shtick, I just want to personally, publicly say thank you to Dr. Bev Bauer. Dr. Bev, as I call her, my Queen Bee, has been a longtime nurturer, mentor, sister friend. And as I was in my graduate studies in the mid-90s at the University of Illinois, I embarked on the Council for the Study of Community Colleges. And in attending, back then we were much smaller. We could all fit around one table. It was about maybe 50 folks, and it was pretty much all of the who's who in terms of community college leadership. Art Cohen, Florence Brower, all of these scholars, and then a smidget of students sprinkled here or there, but no folk of color around the table except for yours truly, Bev. But seeing Bev in that space, and Dean Randy just talked to us about how a lot of times we operate in what has been predominantly white or historically white spaces, was very important because it left an imprint on me in terms of the affirmation of self, in terms of how I want to actualize, and that there are people who look like me doing this work, and that if we didn't study us, then who would? So thank you for that. I also want to give a shout out to Cliff Harper, Dr. Harper, that's my homeboy right there on my mouth. All right. Cliff, again, someone who has been dear and near to me. During my presidency for CSCC, I had the opportunity of forwarding a nomination for who I would want to be president-elect, and I remember that conversation vividly. And he said, who would you want to nominate? Who are your nominees? I said, that's plural. I have a nominee, and that would be Cliff Harper. Oh, okay. And generally what happens is, you make a nomination, the nominations committee, which is chaired by the past president, will then advance that group, and then there's nominations from the floor. And then there was a tie, and then there's a runoff, and of course, Cliff prevailed. And, I have a really good gut instinct. I trust my gut. And I knew he was my guy. And because he's a servant leader, he's a selfless person. He is kind, humble, and is always about advancing the organization. And so with Bev to my front and Cliff in the wings to tag team with me, we had a really wonderful run. And so I want to thank you for your continued collegiality and friendship as well. So I'm not going to repeat the title of today's talk, as Amanda mentioned that. And what I want to do is to spend some time with you kind of unpacking that title, right? So just if you think about the very first part of the title, right? Diversity and divergence. Well, divergence in particular means to break apart from. It's a departure from. It's the separation or bifurcation, if you will. And so I want to talk about how we have been separating, being bifurcated selves within the academy in relationship to what we deem as diversity, okay? So there's an African proverb that I like, and it states, if you want to know the end, look at the beginning. And so I'm going to take y'all back. And, because I think that is very key to give you some context as to why I do what I do. So I grew up on the south side of Chicago, intersections of Inglewood and Gresham. And in my family, I'm first generation collegian. My mother was a secretary, my father was a police officer. And there was a pop quiz in our house. And that pop quiz was, okay, Ebony, what are you going to do when you get older? It's like, go to college? Or what? Go to college? He's like, good girl, we'll feed you now. Okay. Right? So, it's a misnomer, right? That people that go to college come from middle-class backgrounds, but working-class people who have middle-class values, like my parents, who put a lot of time, energy, resources into my development, so much so that when I was a teenager, I had gone to parochial schools, K-12. With the exception of 1 year, I went to University of Chicago Lab School, hated it. That's when I discovered social class. Kids made fun of my lunch. I don't know if any of y'all know what what hog head cheese is? Because I'm in the South. Yes, I know some of y'all know what hog head cheese is. Let's keep it real. Yeah, I was saying hog head cheese and butternut bread. Yeah, that wasn't a good look at the University of Chicago. You know, said, what is that? It was like calico cats, all that going on with your lunch. Or I had on Sykes. I didn't have on Nikes. I had on Sykes. I had sneakers that were in the bin that you see the Sour Patch Kids in when you're about to check out. So I'm like, hold on, sit down here. No box, just tie together. You know. So we were broke. I just didn't know how broke we were. But my parents put all of their resources into my education. And once I got to high school, and I was at Maria. Maria was an all-girls Catholic. It was in Marquette Park. At the time, if anybody is familiar with Chicago, like many metropolitan areas, very racially segregated. The park was across the street from my school, and there was the annual Ku Klux Klan rally. It was routine for me to be called the N-word, get mooned, and all of this stuff. And I remember thinking that I had just had a culture shock because I had gone from a K-8 experience that was entirely black, you know, and I went to Maria where there were 50 black girls out of 1,300, and that was across all 4 grade levels. And freshman year, Sister Grace Ann saying, wow, it's a banner year. So many of you used it. And many of you, wow, there's 350 entering freshmen, and there's 15 black girls, and this is a banner year, right? And you're Lithuanian, you're what? I mean, it just blew the lid off for me in terms of exposure. But it was a blessing because I would not have been prepared for what would come next had I not had that experience in terms of cross-racial socialization, right? So, but my formative years are really such that they were shaped by Holy Angels Catholic School. Holy Angels sat between the Ida B. Wells projects and El Rohi Gang Temple, 39th and Persia, and that was home for me. And that was home, and it was grounding because there I learned, I mean, other than, you know, nuns and priests, that was the only kind of not black folks that I came into contact with. But what I did have was a person-environment fit. I had cultural congruency in that I was taught every day that I was somebody. I couldn't wait till it was my turn to get on the PA and do that. It's your moment in Black history, right? Because we were taught that we came from greatness, and we freaking believed it. Right? And so they were preparing us for the world. They wanted us ready for the world, ready to compete. It wasn't just about 39th Street in the south side of Chicago. It wasn't about the state of Illinois. It wasn't about within this context of the country. It was very revolutionary in that we went to school year-round. They said, you think kids in the nation didn't know? You're going to go to school year-round. We had crews from CBS, people coming through going, how are they doing this with these kids? How are these kids outscoring the rest of the archdiocese, right? When they're 40 in the classroom, and most of them coming up out of projects, right? But ready for the world, ready to compete. At one point, I forgot that motto, and my mother told me, and it was junior year of high school. I remember vividly. She said, you're going to see I got 2 besties, Liana and Tanya. You're going to see them go off to college, and you're going to wave them off to college because the way you're performing right now, you're going to be at either Kennedy King Community College or Daly Community College. And I'm going to just give you a CTA bus pass, and you're going to have to figure it out. And I thought, so horrible. Like, I have to get out of Dodge. I'm not staying here with you. And I got on my road every quarter after that, right? Because I was that kid that was, you know, too cool for school for a certain period. And she was like, what happened to my good girl, my good girl? And when she threatened me with going to community college, right? So now I'm out myself, right? I'm a community college researcher, but I was one of those folks. I was one of those folks that made community colleges prisoners of the I was one of those folks that thought, oh, well, I guess that's where you go when it's a plan B or C. I was one of those folks that thought, well, that's just extension high school. That's going to be college, right? Again, very naive and ignorant to what is really kind of a gem in the landscape of post-secondary at the time. But she told me, I know the United Negro College Fund says the mind is a terrible thing to waste, and that's true. I don't care about your mind anymore. I care about money. So, stop wasting my money, make good on my investment, and get it together, girl. And so I made good on that investment. I think she felt she got a good return. All right, so one of the things in terms of coming from the state of Illinois that is a point of pride, is the fact that the community colleges were birthed in our state, in the land of Lincoln. And so part of what I want to make mention of is when we think about community colleges, from the very onset, there were distinctive features, if you will, for community colleges and how they evolved. I like community colleges because I really felt like once I got into the literature, I'd taken a class my first semester in my doctoral work at Illinois, and not because I wanted the class, get this, y'all gonna love this. So I meet my advisor, and I registered for classes prior to the advising meeting because I know what I'm doing, I'm just gonna pick what I want. And he tells me, okay, keep this, keep that, drop this, drop that, and then pick up this and pick up that. And one of those other things that he wanted me to pick up instead of what I had registered for was the community college seminar. And I told my then advisor, I said, you want me to take community college? He said, yes. I said, but I'm here to study higher education. Woo, right? The hair on the back of my neck stands up now just thinking about the fact that, again, where I was in my development at that time was not even understanding the important role of community colleges within the larger landscape of higher education. So I take this class, I figure I better, it's my first semester, this dude must know what he's talking about, he's been doing this how long. Got in there, and because I had an interest and passion around the trajectories of Black and brown folk in post-secondary, once I saw what those numbers looked like, and at that time it was well over 2/3 of Latino students that were in college were not at places like this, they were at community colleges. And over half of Black students, 58% at that time, 95, were at community colleges. And I was just like, put a fork in me, I'm done. That's it. And then that's when I started to fall in love with community colleges. I came back from that semester break after that first term. I broke up with that advisor. I told him that was a really good suggestion. Thank you very much. Like your services are no longer needed. I switched programs and jumped into the community college leadership piece. Right? So being from Illinois, again, a point of pride for us is the fact that community colleges were birthed there. Prior to the community college, what we know of higher education is not about broadening participation. It's not about increasing access and opportunity. Community colleges arguably could be charged with being the ones that have brought forth the massification era, if you will, because it wasn't about education for the masses, it was about education for the elite. And so for me, that is really revolutionary in terms of an American innovation that really is epic in terms of how do we kind of flip the script and think about how to provide access, how do we really kind of challenge and chip away at the classism that's embedded within higher education. And so with community colleges, most of them, again, for those of you that may not be at community colleges or not familiar with this emergence of them, they evolved out of high schools in many cases. And so was the case with Joliet Junior College. So Joliet was Central High School, and Central High School was the first and oldest and most successful high school-born community college. At one point during the 60s, we talk about it being the community college expansion movement. There was an explosion of community colleges that were popping up all over the country. We had like a plus 400% growth in community colleges, but also because there was a case whereby we wanted to provide opportunities for housing adult and community education, for continuing education post-World War II. And so one of the thoughts I wanted to share with you is that in the origins of community colleges, in the very DNA of community colleges, I feel, is a social justice imperative, right? And so that the fact that we would say we want to broaden access, we want to increase opportunities, we want to have participation across diverse populations is really novel for its time, but it's still a promise that we're still working really hard to keep with. So at Illinois, again, this is really ironic, right? I was that person that was kind of poo-pooing on the community college sector. Then I kind of fall into this, right? It was kind of serendipitous and fall into love, literally, with this area of focus, and went from being the community college critic to the community college cheerleader, right? And so I got recruited back to my alma mater 3 years ago. So I came in the summer of 2014. I got a call. I think you might want to come back home. Like, well, let's talk. And had a wonderful opportunity to join the faculty and then contribute to a program that I was a product of, as well as lead the Office for Community College Research and Leadership. OCCRL has been one of the longest standing community college research hubs in the country. Founded by Deborah Bragg, who was my major advisor during my doctoral studies. OCCRL has endeavored to do much work in the way of those three buckets, if you will. A lot of the work has been concentrated there. But we are branching out even beyond those foundations, and so much of the work we're doing is really trying to center equity-mindedness in terms of how we talk about opportunities, really have a P20 focus and not be so siloed and think about the different issues, challenges, and opportunities across sectors in terms of an educational pipeline. And so it's really about, you know, though it's community college-centric, it's about how do we move diverse youth and adults in, through, and out of community colleges to further education and or to gainful employment, all right? So, diversity and divergence. One of the things that's happening and has been happening for some time is the changing demographics. And so let's just talk about the realities of our changing demography, if you will. Now, this slide here, which comes from the Pew Research Center, shows you what is literally the changing face of America. Take a look, let it soak in. Demographers said initially by 2050, you know, we will have what is a new majority, where the new majority collectively will be racial ethnic minority groups combined will comprise the new majority. That has been taking pace, or keeping pace, or moving at a pace rather, that could readily occur before 2050. And in some parts of the country, we've had a majority minority for some time. Say California, for instance, right? And Texas. And I'm happy you brought up your home state, because now, boom, booyah, right? All right, so part of what we've seen in terms of this shifting demographics has largely been growth relative to Latino populations, and Texas being second, right, only to California in terms of what's happening. So what we see in terms of a trend is a browning of society. There is a graying also of society, and as we have a shrinkage in terms of white population and increasing older populace, we could ill afford to have a throwaway group. And so I think that there's and I love African proverbs. I'm about to throw another one out here. There's one that I love that says, when you're in the same boat, you row together. You row together. And one of the things that we have to catch up to in society, and then also within our institutions as microcosms of the larger society, is that our futures, our fates are inextricably linked one to another. And so it can't just be, why can't these kids be more like those kids? These are all of our kids, and our futures depend on it. So again, with this whole divergence, the bifurcated selves that we see playing out, the way in which our institutions, us individually and then as organizations, have begun to separate from what we see as a commitment to diversity, and not being as aware as we need to be in spotting equity gaps. And so I want to talk to you about where we're at with that and the extent to which race matters. There was a text Cornel West wrote some years ago called Race Matters, right? And while that book, I think it might be about 15 plus years old at this point, it's still very germane. And let me just give you some metrics, just data points, so that we can kind of put things in perspective for why race matters, right? There's a new class that's going to be starting up in less than 2 weeks' time, Black Minds Matter, an open course by J. Luke Wood at San Diego State University. He's got upwards of 11,000 individual registrants, about 140 or some odd satellite campuses that are going to be live streaming and or rebroadcast. OCCRL will be a live broadcast site for Black Minds Matter. But the retort is often, no, but all minds matter. Well, let me push back on that. If all minds matter, we would not see patterns like this. So this is ACT's College and Career Readiness Benchmarks. And what we see in the way of, math and reading, you could see that African Americans have the least readiness or the most underpreparedness, if you will, in these areas when compared to their other counterparts. This slide should be troubling and messing with you for all kind of reasons, okay? If you just look at, for all students, how is it in 2017 that we're only at 2/5 of all students being college ready for reading and math? That's everybody, irrespective of race and ethnicity, right? But then when we drill down to a more granular level and look at it by race and ethnicity with relativeness to where students are faring in regard to one another, you can see that Asian American students, they're outperforming everybody on each metric. And then we still see achievement gaps, some equity gaps relative to other groups, right? So when we look at science and English, right? So kind of roughly 1 out of 10 African Americans ready for science, college ready. 1 in 5 Latinos. All right, and again, remember part of the reality of our changing demography is that the growth in terms of population is with brown folks, right? Okay. One of the reasons why I wanted to, bring up that course with J. Luke Wood in terms of Black Minds Matter, the educational achievement gaps are most pronounced when you drill down and disaggregate by race and ethnicity and gender when you look at African Americans. So what you have is so prevalent that the Journal for Blacks in Higher Education said that if it keeps pace, that Black women will account for 95% of all baccalaureate degrees awarded to African Americans in the next 15 years, right? And so when we talk about, issues of disparity, identifying equity gaps, those that are faring the least well are Black males on our campuses. So when you look at this, and this is from Education Trust West, you can see the national average, right? And that's everybody irrespective of race and ethnicity and gender in terms of who's earning their high school diploma, right? So the national average, roughly 4/5 of folk get a high school diploma. But then again, paltry, just a paucity of people that are in this area of, getting college enrolled. So we got 4/5 that graduate, but only 4 out of 10 of everybody is going on to college. And this is in the knowledge economy period. This is in a global economy time, right? So that's problematic that you only have 4 out of 10 that will enroll overall, and then roughly 1/3 of Black males do. But then when we talk about those that leave with a degree in hand, then again, for Black males, so you only have 1 out of 3 that go to college, but then only 1 of those 3 actually graduate. All right? And then roughly a little over half of that 4 out of 10 of the general population leave with a credential in hand. Hence, this whole college completion agenda, right? So that, when Obama was in office and he talked about America's college promise, or he talked about, the extent to which we needed to have a completion agenda and was very specific about centering community colleges. We can't get to 60% of all adults in the U.S. having some type of post-secondary credential and not talk about community colleges, right? Because today, literally roughly 45% or so students that are in college are not at the UNTs, they're not at comprehensive state four-year institutions, they are at community colleges. And many times students have aspirations that exceed the tier of post-secondary that they enter, right? So that we see a gap, whereas it's upwards of 4/5 that want baccalaureate degrees, but then we see these dismal transfer rates where they hover between 15 to 25% annually. And again, that's not completers, that's just folk that transfer, and that's not necessarily folk that have transferred having completed an associate's or some type of certificate as a credential. All right, so this is a picture for the 4-year adjusted high school graduate cohort for 2013, 2014 adjusted graduation rates by race and ethnicity and other demographics here. And as you can see, with high school graduation, again, roughly all considered, you got about 4/5 of folks that have a high school diploma completed, but then you see how it plays out a little differently by race and ethnicity and by income, and students with disabilities and ELF. All right, so when we think about community colleges, right? And again, I've talked about how, for me, these are revolutionary spaces. These are spaces that organically in the DNA of how they emerged and evolved really were advancing an equity agenda, or at least attempting to, by trying to broaden participation and make education, higher education, something that wasn't just for the masses and the elite. So this is really, when you look at 2017, this is AACC's from the Fast Facts, looking at the demographics of community college students. We have just under 1,200 community colleges in the U.S. That includes the public and the private community colleges. And when you look at students that are in credit-bearing courses that are enrolled, you can see what the numbers are. So just short of half are white students, almost a quarter Hispanic, 13% Black, and so forth, right? And you see the average age, again, higher than what you would see at these traditional residential four-year campuses. One other thing that I wanted to mention is community colleges in terms of the demographics, having a large first-generation student population as well. 12% of students with disabilities are community college students, right? So when I say that 12% actually represents about 3/4 of students with disabilities that are in higher ed. So the bulk of them are actually at two-year institutions. And the irony is that community colleges have more resource dependencies, and so they have the onus of providing reasonable accommodations and meeting the needs of so many with fewer resources than their four-year counterparts. So when we look at associate's degrees awarded, you can see that breakdown, and then you can kind of think about that last slide I showed in terms of contrasting who's enrolled in credit-bearing courses, and then looking at the numbers that leave with degrees in hand. One of the other things I thought would be good for us to talk about as a data point is to look at earnings in contrast to educational attainment. And I think that we have to do a better job in terms of a value proposition for, the fact that we only have 4 out of 10 folks that are leaving high school going on to post-secondary. So that when you look at cumulatively, the effects of choosing not to get an education, what that looks like in terms of your earnings, and then you kind of look at the cumulative effects and how that compounds over the life course of your work life, and what that looks like for folks. That there can be a cumulative disadvantage, if you will, to not going to college and completing, because we have this really big overlooked majority of some college, no degree, right? So we got to figure out how to get folks back on on-ramps to be completers. Okay, so speaking of completion, it's not just enough that we get them in the door, and that's part of the other piece of the title in this talk today was about outcomes, right? How do we get to the outcomes? And one of the things that we do know is that there's ways in which for community colleges that there are punitive effects to the way we talk about student success or student outcomes. College Board uses what is robustly a 4-year kind of, fits-all model when it's community colleges. But we know that when we talk about the completion rate, that we can't just take that model and plop it down on a 2-year context. That contextually, to say that the metrics for how we talk about student success are FIDIACs in terms of first time in any college, or the extent to which you're enrolled full-time, don't stop out, no part-time, right? And that you're completing within a certain period. I mean, that's not the demographic of community college students. One of the things that Dean Randy talked about that just warmed my soul was the fact that this institution, unlike many institutions, actually embraces the transfer function, wants to provide on-ramps and accelerated pathways to get students to complete, are purposely trying to be partners in initiatives to make the transfer function work where students do show up on this. But the problem with that is that while this is a transfer receptive culture, that has not been scaled up, and that's not being replicated across four-year institutions in terms of transfer-friendly environments. The other part of it is that community colleges are still not getting their just due when it comes to the success stories of the completers that we see in this aisle. You know, most students have had some type of community college, whether it was, you know, like myself, I came home in the summer, I did college algebra at Olive Harvey Community College, right? Then there are the students that are, again, we talk about student swirl, you know, long gone is this first time in any institution, don't attend another institution, stay the course, stay full-time, and just wrap it up. No, students are swirling. Multiple institutional attendance is pretty much the new norm. And we have not adjusted our metrics accordingly to look at what is really happening and give credit where credit is due in terms of who has contributed to students being successful and being completers in terms of that community college experience. All right, so when we break down and look at gender by race and ethnicity with educational attainment, you know, it's really interesting, even post, you know, the signing of the Lilly Ledbetter Act and all of that, that we still have this gender inequity in pay, right? And so we hear this number, this figure of, you know, 78 cents on every dollar is what a woman makes. Well, that's true, but let's be clear, that's not all women, that's white women. All right, so let's break it down, because there is a color line, unfortunately, and a pecking order to when we talk about earnings. And that there's also a disproportionality in terms of men with less education across race and ethnicity actually earning more than their female counterparts that actually do confer degrees. So that's a problem still. All right, so then when we look at unemployment, really, again, and I said, what was Cornell's text? Race matters? Okay, so Asians have the least unemployment rates, right? Blacks have the highest unemployment rates. Latinos kind of in between whites and blacks in that mix. But check out, when you look at, you know, for those that didn't complete high school, all the way through folks that have a baccalaureate degree or more, that even in lieu of having formal education and having conferred degrees, that there's still higher unemployment for folks that are degreed, that are persons of color, in contrast to their white counterparts or Asian counterparts, right? So black and brown folks, irrespective of educational level, have higher unemployment rates. All right, and so then when we look at, again, just earnings for everybody, and I wanted to include something that, again, drilled down a little bit more specifically, because that last slide just talked about baccalaureate and higher. Here you can kind of see, for folks that have done graduate work and advanced graduate study, what that looks like in terms of unemployment. And so we see a trend, right? And we've known, y'all are educators, you know this, but we gotta, again, tell the story, you know, to the larger public, because again, what we're seeing in terms of some of the polls are that folks are finding that they're devaluing higher education. They don't see it as important as it once was, right? And so, with the Gallup, most recent Gallup polls, where, higher education, like, who needs that? Ooh, right? Shudder at the thought, but you actually might want to try it, right? Because as you move up with education, you know, so too is there a little bit more of an insulation from unemployment, have more mobility, if you will. than if you had less than high school or only high school. Right? So again, that slide is a good value proposition that all of us can make for why folks need to consider, pursue, and complete post-secondary education. Dean Randy, I'm gonna pick on you again. So we talked about earlier higher ed in terms of white spaces. There's this adage of the ivory towers, right? Y'all have heard of higher ed being called the ivory towers? Well, that's not just figuratively speaking. Look at that slide. It's the ivory towers, all right? So here's what's so curious to me. I was like, man, I'm a 1%er. I know I'm a 1%er, like the 1%. Like, I don't know how I feel about being a 1%. But if you look at for professors, right? So within the academic ranks, we have the different rungs, right? And so lecturers, instructors, on up. So full professors at full rank. So I've been full, 7 years now. And I'm a black woman that's full, right? So I'm a unicorn. If you look all the way over here to your right, it's a little, and you can't even fit the number in there. There's a 1 with the arrow. Like, that's me. That's my category. That's my hey, Bev. In the company of my sister, right? Where the rest of, where y'all at? We need some more of us. But again, by and large, higher ed in terms of, so we have this real dichotomy, right? It's paradoxical, so that the shifting demographics, again, in terms of more folk of color, and as those students move through the pipeline, and then they show up at our campuses, who they interact with in terms of who's in front of them with our faculties, and this is also true of our staff and administrators, do not reflect the diversity of the students that are coming to us, all right? So there's a disconnect there. And so it is still primarily old white men, all right? But let's talk about the context, because context matters, right? And when we talk about where folks are in terms of a place like this is a research institution, or if it's a doctoral, university like a comprehensive state institution that awards some doctorates and has master's programs or liberal arts versus a community college, it looks almost unchanged, right? So irrespective of the institutional type, by institutional type in terms of 2-year or 4-year, right? Or in terms of this whole pedigree, whether it's a research institution or not, again, by and large, about 4/5 of our faculties are white faculty. All right, so I want you all to, we encourage our students to be reflective practitioners, right? And I try to be reflective in practice as well. And, the very first word in the title of this talk was diversity, right? But guess what? For as many of us that are in the room, when we talk about what does diversity mean to you, or how would you define diversity, we could probably come up with that many different definitions. So herein lies a problem with how to wrap ourselves around that. And then with the second question of how you define multiculturalism, right? Multiculturalism has, by and large, been used more in K-12 spaces than within higher ed, unless you talk about multicultural student affairs divisions, right? But it's really been thought of as an educational reform, right? So it's a movement by which a process where the major goals are to really think about structurally what are the inequities and how do we create systemic change so that all learners across the spectrum of difference can achieve academically and be successful, right? That third question, and again, this is just something I'm throwing out as fodder, just ponder it, think about why do you think there's such dilemma and difference? And particularly, there has been in the course of the last year, right? It is not, I guess, any well-kept secret, right? Our campuses are microcosms for the larger society. And what's been brewing outside these ivory towers that is actually spilling over onto our campuses shows that, yes, we definitely have a dilemma in difference. And it's something that, in some respects, I think we've been taking a couple steps back instead of forward. And so we need to really think through that, when we talk about Charlottesville, and the fact that when we say, oh, this is a safe space. Let's interrogate what we mean by creating safe spaces, because every student doesn't necessarily feel safe within a space. And I would push back and say, let's stop talking about how we create safe spaces and talk about brave spaces. You're going to show up. You're going to actually try to make change. You're going to be an activist leader, right? Because everybody, if we're keeping it real, does not feel safe within these spaces. And so this last question of how do you actively engage in equity-minded, culturally responsive practices really gets at, for me, some of our failures, right? Our failures in that as teachers and administrators, we have not been as attuned as we need to be to the needs and the nuances of what students require and what they need. And I think that there's ways in which we also need to come across the aisle. We're very siloed in terms of academic affairs and student affairs, and need to think about collaboratively, particularly when it comes to the student affairs folks, how they are and should be treated as co-curricular partners in advancing the academic mission to produce equitable student outcomes. Because as a faculty member, I get all too well that us faculty are kind of special. We think the universe, revolves around us, and that, when a student is successful, that it must have occurred within the four walls of a classroom. You know what? That ain't what keep them here, right? I could give the liveliest lecture, but at the end of the day, part of what is feeding their souls, part of what has been a lifeline, a reservoir for them to tap into when they feel like, you know what, I don't want to do this, that helps with retention and persistence, are our student affairs brothers and sisters. And so I think there needs to be more candid conversations in how we can reach across the aisle and then have equity-minded approaches to doing things that would academically and socially integrate students to be successful. All right, so all of those little data points that I just showed you, I shared earlier, I think give us a pretty vivid picture. And I think the picture is one that is a pervasive story about opportunity and achievement gaps, right? And so some of the things that get in the way of us having equitable outcomes I have listed here, right? There is an interesting time for me. One class I was teaching educational pluralism and educational leadership in a pluralistic society, and I had a student who, and I taught it from kind of P20 perspective. Student says, I know you say that race matters and all of these other demographic and, different aspects of student identity, that they're germane, but, honestly, when I come into my classroom every morning and I meet my kids, I don't see color. Cringe. Me. Cringe. I'm like, you don't see color? And she says, no, I don't see color. But guess what? I didn't say much, and I didn't have to, because there was a lady named Yolanda. We called her Miss Yo. Miss Yo was from the west side of Detroit. Miss Yo was like, I'm sorry, come again. What you say? You say you don't see color in the morning when your kids come in the classroom. She said, no, I don't. She said, how's that working for you? Are you legally colorblind? Because I'm trying to figure out how you don't. I'm the most colorful thing in here. You don't see me? You don't see me. I was like, okay, Miss Yo, let's time out. Ding, 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 go in your corner, sponge off, now come back, right? But I'm like, you about to get a sparring buddy coming in here with all that colorblind ideology, right? So this notion of culture as invisible, right? When it's very visible, right? The folks aren't just involuntary minorities, walking through. And then the politics of identity, right? A lot of identity politics playing out. And to some extent, us letting some of these microaggressions that kind of come out of the identity politics go unchecked, right? And then the diversity within diverse groups. People often think that, it's like this monolithic kind of worldview. So my first faculty position was at West Virginia University. And I told y'all I'm from the south side of Chicago. So again, culture shock. It's like, dear rural resident. I'm like, ooh, I'm urban. I'm slick. This is hick. What is going on? Well, how did I get here? And, very little diversity, right? But what was curious to me was I was teaching a intro to higher ed class. That night, the topic was student demographics and the changing landscape of higher ed. I had shown the film Higher Learning. That movie's about 20 years old, but it still holds up in terms of, really ambitious, right? Film for talking about all of these different things going on campus. And after the film, I remember, I'll never forget his name was Rick. So, I brought popcorn. We're like, we'll have movie night. Ooh, we're going to connect this to the reading. It's going to be fun. All right, any questions, any comments? Rick. He was like, so, you're a black? And he's looking me up and down. He said, you're a black and you're a female. You're a black, you're a female, and you're kind of young. So you a young black. I said, you got a talent for stating the obvious. I'm going to need you to make your point. And he said, okay, point is, what you doing here? Wouldn't you feel, wait for it, wouldn't you feel more sense of community at one of those colored colleges? Again, cringe, hair on the back of my neck, standing up. I said, did he just say colored? Like, I would forgive you if you were a World War II veteran, because it's a generational thing. Like, my father-in-law used to be like, I was in the colored troop, and the colored, this, that, and the other. Or when I got on the Amtrak train one time, and there was this cute little poppy sitting next to me, and he said, oh, you in school, you writing the paper? I said, no, I'm not in school. I teach, and I'm working on a publication. And he was like, you're a professor? He said, a colored professor? And I was just like, oh, God. He was all jazzed. He's like, you go ahead, girl, like, all right. He like, never thought I'd meet a colored professor. I'm like, okay, now we got enough with the color, right? So, but the fact that, Rick wants to know why I was there. And, fast forward, at the end of this class, I'm outside while they're doing the evaluations, right? And so when Rick comes out, he extends his hand, and he said, Professor, it's been very nice, because he had shared with us that night how, he said, I've never had a black before. I've never had a black, elementary, middle school, high school. And he was like, wait, there was that one custodian, but only if you stayed after school to do activities, would you see him? And then in middle school was that one cafeteria lady. She was nice. She gave me extra tater tots. And, but never, his notion of what black folks were was what he learned on TV, right? So at the end of this class, he tells me, it's been nice. And I said, yeah, it's been wonderful, happy to have you. Stay in touch. He said, I will. He said, I just want you to know, you changed my opinion about your people. I said, whoa, I changed, He said, yeah, because you're not black, you sort of black. So this is the precursor to blackish, right? I was blackish, but this was like 17 years ago, and I was blackish. But he's like, you sort of black, you're not really black, you kind of black, you're like Cosby Show black. And I was just like, oh, hell. All right. And then I had to tell him, I said, Rick, dude, right? Because Rick also told me where not to go. You shouldn't go here or there because it's white militia here. And and then I remember one of his colleagues in class said, Rick, you're kind of scared, don't do that. I was like, oh, hush, child. Well, my narrow black ass don't need to be. I'm going to need you to, and if I am there, can I tell him I know you, and then I can just, flee and be safe, have a safe space, right? But anyhow, this whole diversity, right, within diverse groups, and I tried to explain to him that I am not the voice for my people. I am happy you and I have had a wonderful exchange, and that, but you can't just, make me the exception, and you can't just also make me the rule, right? That for any group of folks, white, black, green, whatever, there's variation. There's diversity within our diverse groups. And so we got to think about that as we talk about the intersectionality of students and their identities and what they're coming to us with in terms of what colors their lens with how they kind of navigate post-secondary, right? All right. So I have a good friend, colleague, Dafina Lazarus Stewart, who we recently brought to Illinois to do a distinguished diversity lecture. And one of the things that I really loved about Dafina goes by DL. DL's talk was some of the distinctions that DL made, because I think that very often there is a conflation with which we talk about diversity and equity and social justice and inclusion and talk about all these things as if they're euphemisms for one another, and they're not synonymous. So I want to share with you some words. I felt like she was dropping pearls of wisdom, if you will, about some of these distinctions. So Dafina Lazarus Stewart. Diversity asks, for instance, who's in the room? Equity would ask, who's trying to get in the room but can't? Whose presence is in the room but is under constant threat of erasure? Inclusion asks, has everyone's ideas been heard? Justice would ask, whose ideas won't be taken seriously because they are not in the majority? Diversity asks, how many more of X group do we have this year than last year? Equity would ask, what conditions have we created that maintain certain groups have a perpetual majority here? Inclusion asks, is this environment safe for everyone to feel like they belong? Justice would ask, whose safety is being sacrificed and minimized to allow others to be comfortable in maintaining their dehumanizing views? Diversity asks, is it separatist to provide funding for ethnic student centers? Equity would ask, what are people experiencing on campus that they don't feel safe and feel isolated and separated from others like themselves? Inclusion would ask, wouldn't it be great to have a program with a panel that debates the Black Lives Matter as a movement? Justice would ask, why would we ever allow the humanity and dignity of a people, this group, to be subject to the debate in the first place? So I think in this way, the contrast of when I talk about diversity and divergence is that on one hand, I'm calling us to actually pivot, right? To separate from what has been this knee-jerk reaction of diversity, which is kind of the bean counting, numerical, surface level ways in which we talk about diversity, and to stop just celebrating increases in mere numbers of X folk and such. And to support and increase what we have in the way of our student support services, our wraparound services, our ways in which we think about the data, and not just collect the data, but connect the data to spot equity gaps, right? So many institutions, in terms of diversity, again, with the bean counting and the initiatives, it's all about getting the students in the door, right? So we encourage that they celebrate diversity. We, don't really go beyond this because there's a dearth of sustained diversity initiatives that get beyond just this kind of numerical representation piece to really advancing diverse learners across the spectrum of difference and making sure that we are trying to kind of chip away and be impactful in how we dismantle practices that are perpetuating inequities on our campuses and impacting our student outcomes. So the other thing that I wanted to make mention of, I kind of alluded to before, with the example from my class with Ms. Yo and one of the other educators in terms of, we've heard time and time again, post-Obama, oh, it's a post-racial society. Yeah, no, it's not. And then this whole notion of color blindness, that quote I love, it's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see. And that's the thing though, right? All of us are shaped by our experiences. And our experiences color the lens by which we see and operate. And so that oftentimes we could be looking at the exact same thing. The thing is the same, but what we see isn't, right? And so how do we find a point of commonality? Well, one way to address how to get to a point where we can spot the equity gaps, get to a point where we try to advance learners across, again, the spectrum of difference in terms of our data is to get beyond collecting the data for reporting purposes, to collect the data very intentionally as an effort to make data-based decision-making that is going to improve our outcomes and make sure that they're more equitable. And so I have these, this is not the whole litany, right? An exhaustive list of different types of items with which you might want to look at, but again, we have to start drilling down and thinking about to what extent through everything we do that we come into it with the equity-minded lens. So the other thing in terms of us having some more work to do is we need to make some systemic educational gains across different learners. And I think one way that we get to, in the center I have student success, one way that we get to that is to, again, think about what are the structures that are impeding where it is we want to land with our students and their outcomes, right? And so once we can kind of look at what systematically is going on and try to really chip away at it, and part of how we chip away at it is to look at the curriculum, right? There are times, again, we have this diverse array of students, but at the same time, there are ways in which our curriculum falls short of our students. So when we think about, you know, I'll use some of the work I've done also is around LGBTQ students in community colleges. And one of the things that bubbled up in a couple studies that we did was this heteronormativity that was happening in classrooms and the extent to which students, LGBTQ students, didn't feel as if, they felt it should be a queering of the curriculum to some extent. And so that there are, again, pockets of students that are walking through our campus and not fully engaged, not feeling affirmed, you know, and I get it. We got to try to be all things to all people, but there are ways in which we can be more deliberate in terms of culturally responsive pedagogical practices across our learners. And then looking at the campus climate. Are the hallways hostile? Do you got chilly campus climate? You know, what is the perceived institutional commitment to diversity at your campuses relative to students, to staff, to faculty, administrative leadership? And how do we work at that to improve that? And again, kind of looking at those wraparound support services, because part of how we get students to the finish line and having them cross over is not just trying to think about the academic side of the house, but to really incorporate both sides of the house more fully, all right? So, having said that, I'm gonna kind of give you a charge today to think about how you might leave here, and some of you are already engaged in this work and are doing it, so sorry if I'm preaching to the choir, but for those of you who, I always look at myself as you know, kind of a project in progress, like we're all in the process of becoming, if you will, that we need to really take a look at ourselves in terms of what we do in our practices. More often than not, what I see is folks are on this side of this continuum, right? I was just thinking, last weekend I was at the Lewis Stokes Minority Center for Excellence conference, NSF meeting, and one of the speakers talked about the STEM faculty all said that they felt very competent as it related to multicultural efficacy and culturally responsive practices, and that they were aware of diversity. And then it was like, but then you looked at the numbers, right? And so the thing is, it's one thing to be aware, right? And then you also may have some knowledge, like you read something somewhere, right? You know. But awareness and knowledge does not necessarily mean that that's transferable or translates into being skilled, or even if you have the skill sets, that you are actively acting on it, like walking the walk, talking the talk, right? All right, so call to action. One of the things that I wanted to say is that I think, you know, our institutions they're so culturally pluralistic right now, more so than they've been than in times past, and it's critical for higher ed to reflect on the diversity of our students, to understand the realities of the changing demography in terms of our changing nation and that literal, you know, changing face, kind of the facelift, if you will, that also is showing up to a campus near you, and that we need to, there's a book by MLK, one of his writings, the title of it is We Can't Wait. So I want to just kind of pitch that to you in terms of we can't wait. You know, why can't we wait is actually the title. And why we can't wait is, you know, basically these 2 bullet points that I have on this slide, right? Diversity is a compelling governmental interest. Again, we cannot afford to have a throwaway group. And as society and life cycles start to evolve, we have to keep pace and recognize the changes that we need and the tune-ups that have to occur in so many different social areas, including our educational programs. So I think that this is a prime time when we think about the legacy of community colleges, the contributions of community colleges, that we revisit the community college mission to gauge if we still have the courage and the passion and the interest and the political will to make meaningful changes on our campuses and in our community. So having recognized that, we have segmented opportunities, whether it's across socioeconomic status, first generation, and or race and ethnicity, that these things are taking place in higher ed, and they're threatening what's at the very core and what I call in the DNA of community colleges in terms of a social justice imperative. So, again, when you're in the same boat, you row together, right? And so lift others as we climb. I have some select references. This is information. Stay in touch. And I guess that will conclude my remarks. And I'm happy to entertain any questions or comments. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me and everybody here today as well. I really enjoyed your remarks this afternoon. As a matter of fact, they're right up the alley of where I am today in my work and with my study as well. I did have an opportunity to meet Jamie Wood a couple of weeks ago and have a conversation around the Black Minds Matter movement that is going on right now. And he's got a lot of good remarks and a lot of good ideas moving this equity bar along the way. One thing that, I've got a whole bunch of questions.
Okay.
But I'll just keep it short. But one of the things that comes to mind when we're talking about demographics within the United States, we're talking about majority, minority switching, all right? Do you feel like the conversation around race, ethnicity, discrimination, and equity is going to change over the time that those demographics continue to change?
Okay, so I think it has been changing and it's ever changing, and one of the things that is really remarkable for me is post-2016 election, the drastic changes that have readily occurred. So just as an example, on my own campus, we saw an uptick in racial bias and hate incidents being reported. So much so that for the first quarter of this year, that exceeded like double almost what we had for the calendar year prior, right? So there is an uptick in racial antipathy on campus. There's an uptick in kind of anti-Semitic and religious, anti-Muslim, and so when you say, is it gonna, I think that, those figures, that some of the realities of those figures, unfortunately, there's a heightened perceived threat with this literal change of face of America. And I think you see that manifest itself in rhetoric like, take the country back. Take it back from who? Make America great again. So that there's ways in which some of it coded and some of it not, just quite overt, where I don't necessarily know that we won't still have some culture clashes and growing pains with regard to what we see in terms of the shift in growth in the numbers for folks of color. I think that I'm hopeful, right? I have to be. I'm a parent. I have 13-year-old twin girls. And, you know, just watching the things that have played out in the last several months, I guess the last 10, 11 months, and then having to kind of unpack that with my children, it's not something that I actually saw coming. It's not something that I thought I would have to bear witness, or they would have to bear witness to. And so, you know, but I try to err on the side of, you know, I know that there are a lot of folks out here who they want to be the change, right? They want to be the change that they want to see and are actively engaged in trying to, again, lift others, right? And this more collectivist mindset, not so much where it's this competitive self-interest at play, but to have cooperative self-interest, because again, all of our experiences, realities, whether we realize it or not, are very linked to one another, right?
We will have questions in just a minute. One of the discussants who's going to give us her comments and her ideas to the explanation. And Kathy, that is articulation specialist.
Thank you for being here and for sharing all the information from your discussion and presentation. I think I have a lot more questions than what the time is allotted for this event for me to discuss about. I think there were a lot of great things that you talked about that really give me pause for concern when I think about what our missions are as community colleges and where we're moving forward to. There was something that you mentioned about the social justice imperative community colleges, which I think is increasingly integral in understanding and embracing when we talk about the students we're serving at our institutions. And so my first question to that would be, you know, in response to it, how do we continue in providing a social justice mission and providing opportunities and advancements for first generation students, students of color, students with disabilities, students who are often not necessarily included at the traditional universities, ivory towers, etc. How do we continue that imperative and that mission when sometimes we have a nose turned up to us as far as the education we're providing in our institutions, when I often have to tell people at universities, you educated the faculty at those institutions. So your nose being upturned to those faculty, other faculty are really curious to me. And then the second part is understanding that shifting demographic and understanding the social justice imperative. You touched upon the faculty and how the faculty resemblance, who's actually teaching in our institutions and what they look like and how they're not representative of our students, and what can we continue to do to, I wouldn't necessarily say fix that, although that does seem like that has to happen, but to really provide more opportunities for faculty of color, first generation faculty who would never have saw themselves in the classroom before, but be a part of the classroom and be a part of educating our future, educating the students who are coming through these doors who oftentimes don't have someone or never saw someone who looked like them in the classroom and didn't know those aspirations could exist. So I know it's kind of a little part.
I think I know how to approach it. So I'll go to the former. So when you talked about the social justice imperative and how I talked about that's kind of, I don't know, woven into the fabric of community colleges in terms of community colleges' origins or roots. I think part of how we try to keep that going, because I think that's at attention, is because there's also been, in lieu of all of these years that, you know, from Joliet to now, there's been some mission drift, some mission creep. I was just looking at an article, was it yesterday? So, Republican Senator John Reagan in New Hampshire is introducing new legislation to try to remove community from the New Hampshire community college system. And his reasoning for that is that, that's stigmatizing. So we should drop community, and we should just be the New Hampshire college system and not the New Hampshire community college system, because the colleges would be received more favorably, right? I think that's very short-sighted and have a lot of problems with that. But that's also kind of a sign of the times, too, in terms of what's been taking place. So there was a study, a piece that was done in Wall Street Journal a couple years ago, or about a year or two ago, where they talked about, I want to say, there's about 80 some odd community colleges that have dropped community from the name, right, over the last 30 years. But in the last 10 years, it's been about 40 or some that have done that, right? So if you think about half of them have done it in the last 10 years versus what has been like a 3-decade trend. And so I think that part of when you talk about how do we continue to meet the needs of such diverse, youth and adults within our colleges is by making sure that we don't forget who we are, right? To stop trying to be like that rung in the ladder that you perceive is ahead of you, and to understand that the nuances and the unique textual good stuff that's a part of the community colleges is very necessary, and that by straying from that you're also taking a step back from advancing certain demographics, right? The other question you had in terms of like with the faculty and staff and administrators and I guess trying to get more diversity, the one thing, that higher ed and K-12, they mirror one another in this regard. When we look at public K-12 teachers, 86% of all teachers in the classroom are white. And then 4/5 of that 86% are white females, okay? So, the only difference is that what we see is primarily white males when we talk post-secondary context, but when we talk, K-5, middle, and secondary is white females. But then when you look at the leadership within K-12, is robustly white males, so they're not in so the instructional leadership, who's in the classroom are white females by and large. And then we see the same thing kind of play out in terms of administrative ranks in higher ed. And I think there have been programs, in terms of diversity fellowships that some community colleges and universities have tried. But I think that part of the problem is a pipeline problem, right? We can't get to a critical mass where you see, more folk like me in a classroom unless we address some of those early numbers, right? I want to take you back. I mean, I know this is about kind of the collegiate context, but so much of what impacts us in terms of students being college ready, in terms of our economy, where we have so many middle skills positions that remain unfilled because, and they're high skill, high demand, high wage, that don't require a baccalaureate degree, but a 2-year degree or certificate. But again, because of the readiness factors or lack thereof, we can't fill them, right? And so I think that part of how we get to the other side of it is by attending to the front end of it.
I know we have at least one hand up. Just raise your hand and we'll get our
Hi, Dr. Brady.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well.
Just so you all know, she's going to be at TCC in January. Come here again. So I would, back on the social justice imperative, so for people who, and I'll say like me, who feel like I am in the action stage, but just not enough, like nothing I do is enough. I'd be really interested to hear a list of sort of do's and don'ts that you would give, especially to white people. Like for instance.
You want me to do the Dear White People episode up here?
Don't say the various things, but do whatever, so I.
Right. Yeah, you know what? I don't know that I could, I wish I had a silver bullet and knew what the panacea was. But I think it kind of gets back to, for me, activist leadership, right? And so I think there's a way in which, and I'll send you, I did this piece a couple months ago, I'll send to you, that does break down like kind of concrete steps. It was my way of purging, and I needed some kind of, some way to process what happened at Charlottesville, right? And so I did this piece for Huffington Post that talked about kind of this call for activist leadership that also talks through these kind of tensions with how we don't see that play out in the way of our results in terms of outcomes and the campus climate. But I think that all too often everybody's well-intentioned, and I think that sometimes part of how we can really go there, and that's something I know you're already aware of and doing, and what I appreciate, I know Dr. Brady here, is that you're being purposeful about trying to create change. But here's the thing about change. Any of y'all participated in, you probably have, I'm sure, some of you, strategic planning, right? Writing up a strategic plan, right? So you spend all this time planning. Okay, so you finally get a plan. The hardest part is the implementation, right? Because conceptually, we could all sit up here and theoretically go, well, you know, I want this to happen and this should happen, and here's our vision and our values and our mission and all of that pie in the sky, and it's utopian, and it's like, ooh, kumbaya, yeah, I like this, I'm feeling this. But then the actuality of it, the carrying out of it, that's where the hard work comes in, right? But you've been engaged in that. And that's the harder part, is shifting culture, right? So we can come up with a plan, but trying to implement it and trying to actually move, like really do a culture shift, that takes time. It takes so much time and a lot of buy-in, right? A lot of buy-in. And so basically my response to you is a couple. One, keep doing what you've been doing, because you have been doing good by students and wanting to help them self-actualize, particularly in terms of her area with folk of color and mathematics, right? Because math so much so is a gatekeeper, right, in many respects, or it could be a gateway, right? And your work has been around making it a gateway. And so to keep doing what you're doing, and then pushing the people around you, right? So when we talked about that need for disaggregating data, right? Challenge when you hear that deficit language, right? You know, well, you know, for whatever reason, Hispanic males just aren't doing well in this program. For whatever reason, okay, how about we have some institutional responsibility, and we're not just gonna blame shift and do a bunch of this, and that we're actually going to individually, and then from an institutional level, kind of come clean on what it is we can do to try to get our hands around this and to try to make strides and move the needle. But that's difficult conversations, right? Because then faculty get defensive, right? Because if you pinpoint and go, so where is it where, you know, we're starting to bleed out? So students are leaving us after this class. What's going on in that class, right? And it, you know, so it gets, it's you know, kind of a tightrope walk, but it's like we gotta go there, and we can't be afraid to go there, and we have to call out that so-called pink elephant in the room, if you will, and hold folks accountable for it. And to understand that we gotta get to a place where we are comfortable being uncomfortable. Myself included, right? So, yeah, you know, so we do so much collecting of data, and we don't utilize it in such a way where we really audit ourselves and hold ourselves accountable for making strides to close those gaps.
Thank you, Dr. Zamani-Gallaher. I am a counseling graduate student here at UNT, so increasing access to services is very dear to my heart. And so my query is mainly based on the image of the people watching the baseball game. I've seen another image of that shared where the fence was removed. And so I would just love to hear more about your thoughts on what removing specific barriers in campuses looks like, maybe examples you've seen in your day-to-day life.
So my background is in psychology, actually. And during my my master's program, I was a TA for the counseling center. And one of the things that was really interesting, I did my undergrad and my master's at Western Illinois University. And, I was told, well, we're happy that your appointment is with us because we're struggling with getting students of color to come into the counseling center. And so they sent me and this guy named Bobby out to kind of like a road show. So we went to La Casa, we went to the Gwendolyn Brooks Cultural Center. We had these listening sessions where we talked to students of color, about, and what we got back, what kept was kind of like, bubbling up and kind of like a point of saturation, like, okay, they're all saying the same thing, is I'm not going over there. I don't trust that office because there's nobody like me there. Right, so when you talk about barriers, so one, for them, while they're saying, and the same thing, some work that was doing with my former institution at Eastern Michigan University, we were talking about why aren't LGBTQ folk of color utilizing the LGBTQ? Like, they actually felt like that office was more about, if you're white and queer, that's not for us, like, that's not for us, and it's like, but no, it's for everybody, right? And so, how do you, make some shifts? So one of the things that we ended up doing was called I led what was called the Sister Circle. Bobby did like an affinity group for men of color, and this was like 1993. And slowly, like after 2 years of doing this stuff, and the other thing is we had to build trust, right? We had to get that trustworthiness, that credibility first with the different groups, and then after that, they were starting to trickle into the counseling center some, and then we had to basically kind of say, no, this, no, how about you, like this counsel, because we weren't licensed, right? We're in training, right? But that was one of the things that, and I would say that we could do in terms of the perception of access. And the extent to which people feel like they have agency and voice. A lot of it does have to do with seeing reflections of self. And so I think that when we're more intentional about doing that, not that everybody that looks alike, I remember my mom telling me there was an incident where I went to see Fiddler on the Roof. We had to attend the play for high school. Remember I told you about what my high school was like across the street from, like in a very racially intolerant area. Because I would literally pass through like 4 different ethnic communities before I would actually arrive, this hour-long bus ride to my school. And so that night, after Fiddler on the Roof, we go across the street to the pizza parlor and, waiting on a ride. This kid's mom was late from choir rehearsal or whatever. And this guy walks in, and he's just like, is this Marquette Park? And I'm 16, and in my naivete, right, I said, why, yes, sir, it is. Like I'm just miss, tourism, like, welcome to Marquette Park, how you doing? But I'm like, yeah, sir, it is. And he said, well, what are you effing N's doing here? And it's like, wait, whoa. And then just ripped into us, right? So as he does that, I'm kind of in analysis paralysis. I don't even remember. And then it was like he kept going. We're the only people of color in the restaurant, and it's a Friday night. So then finally, a young white woman from the rear of the restaurant came up, and she said, that's enough. These are kids. This is horrible, blah, blah, blah. And then he rips into her, oh, you bleeding heart in, lover, da-da. So then her guy gets up from the table and was like, don't talk to my lady like that. And it was only when these 2 white men were about to come to blows that the manager was like, take that on the other side of the, right? And then the police, there's a paddy wagon next door. It's like, here's 7-Eleven, here's Papa T's Pizza, here's the park, that's my school, right? This is the intersection. So we run, officers. And the buses don't run after 5:30 over there, like the Marquette bus didn't run at that point. We tell them what happened. He and his partner are like, yeah, you all have had a really rough night. You take good care now. And they pull off, and we're like, really? Like, what? And so, but I'm telling you all of that to say that was one of those, it created a spark. And I got home, My mother ended up picking us up. She's like, how was the play? Nobody's saying anything. She drops off the guys. She puts the car in front and park in front of our house, and as soon as she does that, I just break down. I'm like that ugly cry. I'm snotting on myself, and she's just like, what is, So when I finally got my stuff together and I tell her, like, Ma, this is what went down, she's just like, oh, why didn't you say anything? Because I knew you would have went in there flipping over salt and pepper and red pepper and Parmesan. It's like, you don't talk to my baby like, so I don't want to start nothing. And so we called my dad. My dad's a cop. He's like, well, did you get the squad car number? Did you see a badge number? Did you, but we ended up filing a report. There ended up being another incident, but with some Asian students a couple months later, and they got another citation over there. And she said, because I was angry. And I told her how when I went to school that Monday that Maureen, friend of mine that ran track with me, and Mo was like, hey, Ebo, and I'm like, Ebo, Ebenezer, what's happening? Ibs. And I said, you white folk always trying to give us little acronyms. My name, Ebony, it means black, so like too black, too strong, right? And she's like, ooh, your panties are in a bunch. And I'm like, Mo, she said, I just wanted to say good morning. And I was like, good morning. And I said, what the hell's so good about it? I guess it's good if you're white, huh? And she was like, what the, right? So I tell my mom about this, and she's like, you said what to her? She's like, so you're going to apologize to her. I'm like, I'm not apologizing for nothing, I'm all hard, right? And she's like, no, you're going to do it, or else I'm going to go up to the school with you, and I'm going to make you do it in front. And I was like, well, why? She said, look, everybody that looks like you isn't necessarily against you, right? Or for you, right? That looks like you. And everybody that's not your mirror image is not antithetical, is not against you. And for me, that blew the lid off, right? And so then when I got to undergrad and had Dr. Allen, my first mentor, I didn't even know what a mentor was. It was second semester, freshman year. Talk about barriers. End of the class, he says, I want you to come see me. And I was like, did I not do well on the test? I'm not going to get an A? He said, no, your grade is fine. I want you to come talk to me about your future. I'm like, for what? And he said, I think you got a bright future. I said, I got an academic advisor. He said, but do you have a mentor? I'm like, what is that? And then I, dodged the man for a whole year. My line sister is up here at the front table. So the semester we were pledging, and I was trying to get out of Dodge from them AKAs. I saw Dr. Allen, and I'm like, this is a good time for that talk. Yeah, man, how you doing? These sorority girls. And so anyway, he says, so what do you want to be when you grow up? And I jokingly said, well, maybe I'll be a professor like you. I'm like kidding. And he straight face. He just received it. He said, oh, a professor. Okay, so let's work our way backwards. You're going to need a PhD. So what do you think are the steps in between? And I'm like, this dude is taking me seriously. But it was at that moment, again, somebody that looks nothing like me. I'm like, here's this curly-haired white dude that's just like, his nickname in our house is Two Daddy. I call him Second Father, right? He has been there for every major life moment for me. So much so, it's so funny, like when I got my PhD, his eldest daughter, because the kids call me the surrogate, right? Surrogate daughter. But she said, well, I just need you to know that we can't stay for, when you go out after, because Margaret, she just had a baby, and it's her first Mother's Day. And I graduated on Mother's Day. But they were with me at graduation. They were like, really? I just gave you a grandchild, and you at Ebony's. He said, but Ebony getting a PhD, So, so I say all that to say that there are barriers that are real, and then there are some that are perceived. I perceived that fence was there. And it wasn't until I had someone that was still, he saw a diamond in the rough. He saw something in me that said something to me, right? That I was like, okay, well, maybe, yeah, I guess I can do this. And so be that person, right? Be that person, because sometimes, and then be patient with folk like, us first generation folks that, again, I'm kind of suspicious, I got an academic advisor, what you want? But, what a blessing that this man has been to me and my life and to my family, to that. right? And it was funny, there's this sculpture called The Mentor. It's a Canadian artist. I got that for him. There's an accompanying poem that the artist's father wrote, and I got it mounted on a plaque and got it engraved and went back for homecoming and stuff, and went out to Perkins to breakfast to give it to him. And another sorority sister, my line daughter, my pledge daughter's line sister, Desiree, "Hey, Eb, I didn't know you were going to be here." And I'm like, "Yeah, who you here with?" "I'm here with my folks." "Ah, okay," her and Denise. And they're looking like, "We didn't know you had a different strokes type of growing up. What's up? You up in here with these white folks?" I'm like, "Yeah, this is Daddy." And they're just all like, and they were looking like, all this time, we didn't, I'm like, y'all so silly. I'm like, this is my mentor. And, you know, but I was like, don't you see the resemblance? We starting to look alike, man. We've been in each other's lives so long. So, but yeah, be the change you want to see. Stay vigilant and trying to remove the barriers. Understand that some of them are real and others are perceived. And even if they're real, just stay the course. Just stay the course.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I really appreciated hearing the comments when you said that we have to be open to difficult conversations. And so I wanted to just maybe provide a comment to the question that you answered in terms of what we can do. And your sort of answer of like, well, nothing that's doing what we're doing. And I'd like to kind of challenge that because based on all the information that we're seeing, obviously I think what all of us are doing here in this room, something very big is not working, right? So we have that difficult conversation of how do we look at ourselves and ask ourselves not what are we doing, but perhaps what are we not doing. And also just this, we talk about cultural equity without ever questioning the cultural practices within our own institutions sometimes or in our own environment, right? So we say this higher education academia is a primarily white male space. And the assumption that if you remove those white male bodies, something will change.
No, not necessarily.
Maybe, but you know, that there's systems and the processes and the structures of our institutions, of higher education, and looking at those and pushing ourselves to challenge at what we do at every level, right? Whether it's the administrative or the faculty. And just one last thing in terms of the faculty perspective of as a faculty member, as a woman of color, part of what I try to bring to the classroom, the perspective that I try to bring is also the challenging the curriculum. And the traditional curriculums and who, not only who's at the front of the classroom, but who's in those textbooks.
Yeah, who decides what it is that we learn? You know, that's another way, right, that the identity politics pop up. It's in the pedagogy. Thank you.